Good day, everyone. This course today will cover the final ruling for respirable crystalline silica for both the construction and general industry standards. Crystalline silica is a common mineral found in many naturally occurring materials and used in many industrial products and at construction sites. Materials like sand, concrete, stone, and mortar contain crystalline silica. This silica is also used to make products such as glass, pottery, ceramics, bricks, concrete, and artificial stone. In order to help prevent occupational exposures to crystalline silica, OSHA updated this standard with the final rule published in March of 2016. With this final ruling, OSHA has two standards that are enforceable. That is the General Industry Maritime Standard and the Construction Standard. This is a similar breakdown to other OSHA standards, with construction generally being defined as work for construction, alteration, and/or repair, and general industry being any industry not included in construction, maritime, or agriculture. There are several chronic diseases that are associated with occupational silica exposure. These include silicosis. Silicosis happens when silica dust enters the lungs and it causes the formation of scar tissue, which makes it difficult for the lungs to take in oxygen. Onset typically takes 15 to 20 years of occupational exposures to respirable crystalline silica. Symptoms may or may not be obvious. Therefore, workers need to have a chest X-ray to determine if there is lung damage. As the disease progresses, the workers may experience shortness of breath upon a physical exertion. In the later stages, the worker may experience fatigue, extreme shortness of breath, chest pain, or respiratory failure. Silica exposure can also increase the risk of developing lung cancer and increase the risk to other lung diseases, primarily COPD, which includes emphysema and chronic bronchitis. And finally, studies of workers exposed to respirable crystalline silica have found that these workers are at increased risk of developing kidney disease. Shown here are the formulas used to calculate the old permissible exposure limits for silica. These old pills were what we called floating pills and were dependent upon the percentage of the three forms of silica in the source material. That is, how much coarse, cristobalite, and tritonite were in that material. With the calculations shown here representing the pill for quartz and then the pill for cristobalite and tritonite being half that amount. Under the new standard, we now have set pills and action limits that do not require calculations of these limits. The pill for silica is now set at 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air, and the action limit is set to 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air. And these limits cover all forms of silica, not just quartz. This standard applies to all occupational exposures to respirable crystalline silica, such as but not limited to exposures from chipping, cutting, sawing, drilling, grinding, sanding, and crushing of concrete, brick, block, rock, and stone products, as you would find in the construction industry. And exposures from using sand products such as glass manufacturing, foundries, and sandblasting in general industry. All right, a few definitions. From the construction standard, a competent person is defined as someone who is able to identify existing and foreseeable respirable crystalline silica hazards in the workplace, and someone who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate or minimize those hazards. Employee exposure means the exposure to airborne respirable crystalline silica that would occur if the employee were not using a respirator. And objective data. This means information, air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys or calculations based on the composition of a substance, demonstrating employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica associated with a particular product or material or specific process, task, or activity. The data must reflect workplace conditions closely resembling or with a higher exposure potential than the processes, types of materials, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operation. This definition is important, as we shall see, if an employer is planning on using the performance option as part of the employer's exposure assessment. As you can see here from what I would say is an incomplete list, there are a wide range of industries and operations with a potential exposure to silica in the workplace. Shown here is the layout of the general industry standard, and we're going to try to touch on each of the major graphs found within the standard. As stated before, the scope of the general industry standard covers all occupational exposures to respirable crystalline silica, except those in construction, which are covered under the construction standard, and agricultural operations and exposures that result from the processing of absorptive clays. Under limited circumstances, employers in general industry can follow the construction standard as long as the task being performed is indistinguishable from a construction task listed on Table 1, which we'll see later, and the task will not be performed regularly in the same environment and conditions. Employers must assess each employee's exposure to silica who is or may reasonably be expected to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica at or above the action level. And this exposure assessment can be achieved in one of two ways, either by means of the performance option or the scheduled monitoring option. Let's take a look at these two assessment options. The performance option gives the employer the option of using any combination of air monitoring data or objective data sufficient to accurately characterize employee exposures to respirable crystalline silica. For objective data, this data can include air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys or calculations based on the composition of the substance. This data must also demonstrate that the employee exposure is associated with a particular product or material or a specific process, task, or activity. And this data must also closely resemble your workplace conditions or with higher exposure potential than the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operations. The other option for exposure assessment is the scheduled monitoring option for employees who may reasonably be expected to be exposed to silica at or above the action level. This option prescribes a schedule for performing initial monitoring and periodic personal monitoring for exposed employees. If initial monitoring indicates that employee exposures are below the action level, the employer may discontinue monitoring for those employees. Where the most recent exposure monitoring indicates that employee exposures are at or above the action level but below the permissible exposure limit, the employer shall repeat such monitoring within 6 months. Where the most recent exposure monitoring indicates that employee exposures are above the PEL, the employer shall repeat such monitoring within 3 months. Where the most recent non-initial exposure monitoring indicates that employee exposures are below the action level, the employer shall repeat such monitoring within 6 months until 2 consecutive measurements taken 7 or more days apart are below the action level, at which time the employer may discontinue monitoring for those employees. And then you must reassess exposures whenever a change in production, process, control equipment, personnel, or work practices may reasonably be expected to result in new or additional exposures at or above the action level, or when the employer has any reason to believe that new or additional exposures at or above the action level have occurred. All exposure samples that are taken must be evaluated by a laboratory that analyzes air samples for silica in accordance with the procedures in Appendix A, which are shown here. Employees must be notified of these sampling results within 15 working days after completing an exposure assessment. The employer shall also individually notify each affected employee in writing of the results of that assessment or post the results in an appropriate location accessible to all affected employees. And whenever an exposure assessment indicates that employee exposure is above the permissible exposure limit, the employer shall describe in the written notification the corrective action being taken to reduce employee exposure to or below the PEL. When employees are exposed to silica above the PEL, the employer shall demarcate regulated areas from the rest of the workplace in a manner that minimizes the number of employees exposed to silica within the regulated area. And the employer must post warning signs at the entrances of regulated area which states danger, respirable crystalline silica may cause cancer, causes damage to lungs, Wear respiratory protection in this area. Authorized personnel only. Access to regulated areas must be limited to persons authorized by the employer and required by work duties to be present in the regulated area. Any person entering such an area as a designated representative of employees for the purpose of exercising the right to observe monitoring procedures, and any person authorized by the Occupational Safety and Health Act to be in a regulated area. If an area is found to be over the Pell, then the employer must implement controls for that hazard. Generally, we try to follow OSHA's hierarchy of controls. That is, first we try to engineer out the hazard, and this can be accomplished by means of ventilation or dust suppression with wet methods. Next, we try to implement work practice controls, such as cleaning or worker position to minimize their exposure and so on. And then finally, whenever such feasible engineering and work practice controls are not sufficient to reduce employee exposure to below the Pell, the employer shall nonetheless use them to reduce employee exposure to the lowest feasible level, and then you can supplement with the use of respiratory protection. Under engineering controls, employers can use any dust or work practice controls to protect their workers, such as wet methods, enclosures, dust collection systems, and local exhaust ventilation. Here we can see some of the differences implementing engineering controls. On the left, we see an employee grinding on stone without engineering controls. And on the right, they're using wet methods to control the amount of dust generated. Similarly, we see an employee grinding on concrete without engineering controls on the left. And on the right, they're using a vacuum dust collection system attached to the grinder to limit the fugitive dust. Respirators are to be used when engineering or administrative controls cannot reduce a worker's exposure to below the permissible exposure limit. They are also to be used during the interim installation of engineering controls, such as local exhaust ventilation, and where exposures exceed the Pell during tasks, such as certain maintenance and repair tasks for which engineering and work practice controls are not feasible. If there is silica in the workplace, the employer must have in place a written exposure control plan that addresses a description of the tasks in the workplace that involve exposure to silica, a description of the engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection used to limit employee exposure to silica for each task, a description of the housekeeping measures used to limit employee exposure, and the employer must review and evaluate the effectiveness of the written exposure control plan at least annually and update it as necessary. This written plan must be made available to each employee, the employee's designated representatives, and to OSHA. If you're conducting abrasive blasting using crystalline silica, the employer must comply with other applicable OSHA standards, such as 1910.94 for ventilation, 1915.34 for mechanical paint removers, and 1915 subpart I for personal protective equipment. If you as the employer will be using respiratory protection in accordance with this standard to protect employees, then you must also comply with the respiratory protection standard 1910.134 and provide those employees with an appropriate respirator. Respirator use will be required when exposures exceed the permissible exposure limit during periods necessary to install or implement feasible engineering and work practice controls. Exposures exceed the Pell during tasks such as certain maintenance and repair tasks for which engineering and work practice controls are not feasible, during tasks for which an employer has implemented all feasible engineering and work practice controls, and those controls are not sufficient to reduce exposures below the Pell, and during periods when an employee is in a regulated area. For the purposes of housekeeping, we want to ensure that we are not contributing to an employee's exposure during this task. And for this reason, the employer must not allow dry sweeping or dry brushing, as these can increase the amount of dust in the air. And the same can be said for using compressed air to clean clothing or surfaces. Instead, we want to use wet sweeping or mopping, or use a HEPA vacuum for cleaning, but only if they are feasible. If they're not feasible, then the other methods of housekeeping can be used. For employees that are exposed to respirable crystalline silica above the PEL for 30 or more days per year, the employer must make medical surveillance available to those employees. The initial baseline medical examination should cover the employee's medical and work history with an emphasis on the employee's past, present, and anticipated exposure to silica, dust, and other agents affecting the respiratory system. This should also include a physical examination with special emphasis on the respiratory system, a chest X-ray, and a pulmonary function test, and a tuberculosis test on the initial examination. These medical examinations shall be made available to exposed employees at least every 3 years or more frequently if recommended by the physician or other licensed healthcare professional. When your employees are sent off to their medical evaluation, the physician must be provided with a copy of this standard, a description of the employee's former, current, and anticipated duties as they relate to the employee's occupational exposure to silica, the employee's former, current, and anticipated levels of occupational exposure to silica, a description of any personal protective equipment used or to be used by the employee, including when and for how long the employee has used or will use that equipment, and information from records of employment-related medical examinations previously provided to the employee and currently within the control of the employer. For the written medical report for the employer shall ensure that the physician explains to the employee the results of the medical examination and provides each employee with a written medical report within 30 days of each medical examination performed. This report shall include a statement indicating the results of the medical examination, including any medical conditions that would place an employee at increased risk of material impairment to health from exposure to silica, and any medical conditions that require further evaluation or treatment. Any recommended limitations on the employee's use of respirators, any recommended limitations on the employee's exposure to silica, and a statement about the results of the chest X-ray. For the written medical opinion for the employer within 30 days of the medical examination, the written opinion shall contain only the following: the date of the examination, a statement that the examination has met the requirements of this section, and any recommended limitations on the employee's use of respirators. If the employee provides written authorization, the written medical opinion for the employer may also include any recommended limitations on the employee's exposure to silica and a statement on the need of specialists based on the X-ray. As a supplement to your hazard communication training, the employer shall include respirable crystalline silica in the program, and the employer shall ensure that the hazards of cancer, lung effects, immune system effects, and kidney effects are addressed. This training should also cover tasks that involve exposure, engineering and work practice controls used at the site, silica standard, that is, the standard is provided to the employees, and medical surveillance. For record keeping, records that must be maintained are air monitoring data, objective data, and medical information on the employee shall include the name, a copy of the physician's and specialists' written medical opinions, and a copy of the information provided to the physicians and specialists. And keep all of this information in accordance with 1910.1020, the record keeping standard. Record keeping for the air monitoring data should address the date of measurement for each sample taken, the task monitored, sampling and analytical methods used, number, duration, and results of samples taken, identity of the laboratory that performed the analysis, type of personal protective equipment such as respirators worn by the employees monitored, and name and job classification of all employees represented by the monitoring, indicating which employees were actually monitored. Objective data for record keeping must address the silica-containing material in question, the source of the objective data, the testing protocol and results of testing, a description of the process, task, or activity on which the objective data were based, and other data relevant to the process, task, activity, material, or exposures on which the objective data were based. All right, let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about the construction standard and some of the differences between the general industry and construction standards, particularly paragraphs C and D of this standard, which are the specified exposure control methods and the alternative exposure control methods, with the alternative exposure control methods mirroring those requirements laid out in the general industry standard. Generally speaking, everything else is pretty much the same between these two standards. As per the scope of this standard covers all occupational exposures to silica in the construction industry, except for those exposures that are below 25 micrograms per cubic meter air action level. Table 1 in this standard lists 18 different tasks with effective engineering controls, work practice controls, and in some cases, respiratory protection. The main benefit for Table 1 exposure control methods is that employers that fully and properly implement those controls do not have to comply with the Pell or conduct exposure monitoring of employees engaged with those tasks. The layout of the table is shown here. In the left column, it lists the operation that is being performed. The next column tells you which engineering or work practice controls that must be implemented to be in compliance. And the last columns determine if respiratory protection is needed or not for that task. And the need for respiratory protection is dependent in some instances whether the employee is performing that operation less than 4 hours per day or greater than 4 hours per day. So let's go through a few of these operations listed in Table 1. First on the list is the use of stationary masonry saws. Engineering controls for this task require that the employee use a saw equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. There's no requirement for the use of respiratory protection as long as water is being used while operating this setup for the saw. Next is the use of handheld masonry saws. Engineering controls require that you use a saw equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade, similar to the stationary saws. For respiratory protection, we will have to examine a couple of different factors of how long and where this saw will be used. For employees that are working outdoors and performing this task for less than 4 hours per day, respirators are not required to be worn. For those outdoor workers performing this task greater than 4 hours per day, will need to wear a respirator with a minimum assigned protection factor of 10. For all indoor work performing this operation, it requires employees to wear respiratory protection with an assigned protection factor of 10. Assigned protection factors can be found on the respirator that is being used, but generally, a half-mask negative pressure respirator has an APF of 10, and this would often include N95 dust masks, but you should always check with the manufacturer before using a respirator. Next is the use of handheld power saw for cutting fiber cement board with blade diameter of 8 inches or less. Engineering controls address that this task is performed outdoors only and requires the use of a commercially available dust collection system, and that dust collector must provide the airflow recommended by the tool manufacturer or grader and have a filter with a 99% or greater efficiency, that is a HEPA filter. There is no requirement for respiratory protection with this setup. Shown here are all the tasks that are listed in Table 1, but I think we kind of get the idea here. If you fall under the construction standard and are going to use the specified control methods to be in compliance with the standard, you must consult with Table 1 to determine appropriate control methods for the particular task at hand. So who is engaged with Table 1? Employees are considered engaged with the task when they are the one operating the listed equipment, assisted with the task, or have some responsibility for completion of that operation. Employees in the vicinity of a task are not considered to be engaged in the task, but if they have exposure, the employer is still responsible to ensure they are not being overexposed to silica. If exposures are above the Pell despite the full implementation of the specified engineering and work practice controls, those employees would be required to wear respiratory protection, and all employees engaged in that task must wear that protection for the entire duration of the task. For employees that are performing more than one task listed in Table 1 during the course of a shift, and the total duration of all tasks combined is more than 4 hours, the required respiratory protection for each task is the respiratory protection specified for more than 4 hours per shift. If the total duration of all tasks on Table 1 combined is less than 4 hours, the required respiratory protection for each task is the respiratory protection specified for less than 4 hours per shift. For employers that are using either specified exposure control methods or alternative exposure control methods, the employer must have in place a written exposure control plan that addresses a description of the tasks in the workplace that involve exposure to silica, a description of the engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection used to limit employee exposure to silica for each task, a description of the housekeeping measures used to limit employee exposure, a description of the procedures used to restrict access to work areas when necessary to minimize the number of employees exposed to respirable crystalline silica and their level of exposure, including exposures generated by other employers or sole proprietors. For construction, the employers must designate a competent person to implement the written exposure control plan. This is a person capable of identifying existing and foreseeable respirable crystalline silica hazards, who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures and makes frequent and regular inspections of job sites, materials, and equipment being used. The employer shall make medical surveillance available at no cost to the employee and at a reasonable time and place for each employee who will be required under this section to use a respirator for 30 or more days per year. These examinations must be offered at least every 3 years for exposed employees, and the exam shall include a medical and work history, physical exam, chest x-ray, and a pulmonary function test, a TB test on the initial exam only. This concludes our presentation on respirable crystalline silica. For further questions or inquiries, you can reach me or coworkers at the Kentucky Education and Labor Cabinet. Thank you.